Hello everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It's pretty nice to have my first talk this year. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I will talk today about Vue Dynamic Forms. This a library that I've been working on for a few months. It's a way to create forms based on metadata. So first of all, let me introduce myself so you can learn more about me. For the ones who don't know me yet, I'm Alvaro Saburido. I'm front-end engineer at Netcentric. I work as a tech lead. And you can find me in GitHub and Dev2. I wrote a lot of content. I'm constantly exchanging knowledge in social media like Twitter. So I work at Netcentric as front-end tech lead. Right now we're working on a cool project in Vue. We're going to start the migration soon to Vue 3. And I have like 2 years around coding in Vue, okay? So for you to know a little bit of my background, I started working like 6, 7 years ago in WordPress. That was my first job. Meanwhile, I wasn't on the university. It was my way to pay my stuff. So I learned how to program with PHP and WordPress. Later, I had a boss that introduced me to Angular.js and the first version. And I started to get into all this framework world to build more awesome applications in that time. So my first real jobs here in Spain were basically building hybrid applications with Angular 2 and with Ionic. So we built a lot of cool mobile applications, the hybrid developments there. And in one point, I started flirting around with React, but I didn't like it that much, so I fell in love with Vue. I started to coding in Vue here in Netcentric as a side project or internal project to build a dashboard for all the Netcentricos, all the employees to check their statuses. And then I fell in love with it. Later, I started growing in the community and know more people, especially in Nuxt and in Hasura as a backend. So this is kind of my tech stack right now. I use Vue, Nuxt for static web pages, and Hasura for backend. So enough about me. Let's talk about the agenda today. So we're going to talk about forms, basically, and how we normally code them. I will introduce you what is a dynamic form, the basic architecture of it, components, how I build the library itself, and a little demo. So how we normally code forms. If you're a developer in one point of your career, you'll probably build a lot of forms, right? It's something that is really useful in the development. It's a way to get input from users. It could be a registration form, it could be a login, it could be a form to get a product, etc. Right? So we normally just code everything in HTML and create a bunch of inputs and selects and all our form elements basically by hand, right? And it gets to a point, especially when we are dealing with real-world applications and enterprise stuff, that sometimes forms can get a nightmare, like UX nightmare, as I show you here in this slide. A bunch of different inputs to get the user data, etc., and it becomes more complicated, right? Building handcrafted forms first is costly because you need developers to continue working on it and maintaining it. So it's time consuming because you need to create each one of the inputs and how they connect with the state. Let's talk more in a SVA and Redux kind of way of a state that holds the data for that form. It's pretty rigid because the client, for example, cannot modify. It needs that the developers create a new release if they want changes in the inputs or they want a change in the form that is made and so on. So what if we create the forms dynamically? We render basic on a metadata that describes the business logic, basically an object. Okay, it could be an object that you retrieve from an Axios API call, or you can have it in a JSON or even in your JavaScript types, right? And what it does is that it creates everything automatically. It renders all the components. Bam, we have a good solution because actually you can sell it to your client in a way that you can do your forms or create your forms in a CRM or a CMS or whatever, and you don't need to create a new development or deployment process again to modify it. So you can do quick start testing, for example, test A and B and so on. So how actually we can achieve this, right? So the principal idea is that we create each field with an object, right? That will define all the properties and methods that they have. For a login page, for example, we have an email field and an object that is a password field. So bam, this creates an email and a password, okay? It's that simple. So you only define fields for each one of them that you need for your business case or your use case. So it is magic. It's really magic. Of course, it has a lot of engineering behind it, right? So at the end, it's just a fields object, okay, holding all of the different parts of the form that you need. Let's say a username, an email, a password, with the correspondent field type or factory function. And then you pass it through as a prop to a dynamic form, that a dynamic form component, sorry, that is basically a Vue component. So that Vue component, what it does is that it map all the fields that you're passing as a props and create the controls. But what that I mean with the controls are, oh wait. What happened? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the controls, what they are just basically another object that comes from the fields objects and adds some stuff, some properties for validation to know if the field is dirtied, if the field has been touched or blurred, etc. And the validation that. So we will see a little bit more of that afterwards. So what it does is takes the control after creating them from the mapping and just iterate them with a v-for inside of the dynamic form. And it uses another component that is the dynamic input component. It takes a control as a prop. So each one of the field would create another dynamic input component inside. So a little bit of code, it will be something like this. This is a TextField object once it's created. It has a bunch of properties for customizing the class of the styles, if it's disabled, if it's required, etc. And this becomes a form control in that mapping. And as I explained before, you can see that the properties like dirty, like read only and touch it, if it's valid or not, and the errors are being added automatically. Okay? So we have that component, the dynamic component in. What it does actually and how it knows what to render. So inside of it, it needs to know what kind of control are you. And with a conditional, we say, okay, if it's a control of type text, let's render a text input component. If it's a dropdown, well, let's render a select input component, and so on and so forth. Okay. So depending on the control that you define in the objects, it will render a different kind of. So let's dig a little bit into what the actual code is. So we have the dynamic form itself. It's basically a form that takes some properties from the props, like an ID and name. This is a little bit of the code that is in the repo. More likely the code that was for the version 2 of Vue. Right now, the version 3, it uses a little bit more of render function instead of templating. But to showing it what it was, its template, and how it works in the beginning, I will show the normal one, okay, with the HTML. So we have a form, and inside of the form, we have the dynamic input that is being iterated with the controls, and we're passing the controls down. We also see that we have some methods like submitted, change, and blur that work between the dynamic form component and the inputs inside. So as props, we have ID fields and options, and events, we have the submission of the form. We had changed to get the values in real time, and we have an error. Important to say here is that if we do the submit, it will validate the form if required. All the validation that we're defining on the forms will be validated. If we use the change event, we actually will have the latest state of the form values inside, but without any validation. So about the dynamic input component, it looks similar to this. It's just an input, a lot of components, input text component, input select component for each of the types that we have. Sometimes are reused, like email is just basically a text-based component, password also URL. So some of them are grouped together. This is a short piece of it. There are more. This was actually taken from the V2 also. In the Vue 3 support version, it's been done with render functions, so it's pretty much, how do I say it, it's improved in the way that there is not too much template inside. So as props, we have the control and the submit, and as events, we have the change, blur, and focus. You can recognize these ones from the input itself because it allows you to detect the changes when it's blur and when it's focus. And we put it up to the dynamic form. So the input text, as an example, is just an input, and you can see that all the attributes are taken from the form control, okay? And we have some events below. So basically, it takes the as a prop from the parent component, the control, and it emits some events up, like the change, the blur, and the focus. This is an example of the input select for taking. It takes a control, and it works similar to the other one, just that for this object, we have an options attribute that we iterate and show. So this is more or less a mojo of the whole library. But a lot of people ask me before I finish that, how do we submit this button or this form if there is no button, right? I only show you the dynamic form component, but you can create a button outside with submit attribute as true. And as long as you pass a form attribute similar to the form ID, well, similar not equal, it will trigger the submit event in the form. So the validations will be considered. In case you want a workflow that is auto-saving without any button, or you want to show the values right away, you can use the change event to get that done. You pass a function and you save all the values that it comes from the form component. So a really important part of the forms implementation is the validation. And it's basically because we normally use forms to talk with backends or other services, and we need to assure that that data is not compromised or it's not invalid, right? We want all the HTTP requests to be valid and we pass the correct data, right? And that all the fields that are required for that call are there. So the library itself comes with a self-made validation. It's really simple. You just need to create an array of the validations that you want for each field. In this case, I'm showing a password example. So it's an array and you pass the validation. The validators are only functions. This case, I'm showing the pattern one that you can pass a regex that will test against the value of the input. And if there is an issue, it will show a text with whatever you want to say, like, for example, the password didn't pass the accepted criteria, and it will show something similar to this. So the form itself, or the component itself, is style agnostic. It only has classes, so you can use or style as you prefer. It does have a theme, but it's not really used. Okay, you can import it and modify the variables if you want, so you have a more straight away solution. So I will do a little demo. Okay. Okay, let's open a Chrome tab. And let's search for this one. Okay, so the library right now has a URL that you can see all the examples of the demos. Let's go for the login one, for example. And here you can see what is built with the code that we were making, right? So to check it better, this is still the presentation. Let me try to put the another window maybe. Okay, so this is the example of how it looks once implemented. This is an email field with the password. And if I try to type an incorrect email, it will complain blur and say, hey, this email format is incorrect, right? If I try to put it correctly, now it will succeed and will show a class that you can style as you prefer here in the dynamic form with the success class. As if you try to submit and there are required elements, it will complain and will say, hey, this one is required, please filling in. And the same goes for the other validation. If I try to type something here, it will test it with the pattern that I showed you before, and I will complain if the pattern is not fulfilled in this case. But I wanted to show also how it looks in the with the view inspector. So I will change again. You can see the new window. Can you confirm me if you can see it? Okay. So let's take the same one, and if we go to the view, of course, it's not going to show the view one. Well, for some reason, the Vue DevTools is not working right now. I don't have it in this URL. So well, I could show you afterwards another example of that. So let's get back to the presentation. Okay, so it got to a point that I say, okay, I need this to be reusable because I was implementing forms all over the place in my personal projects and my company projects and internal, etc. And I needed to do a place that holds all my code and I can reuse it, install it, right? So how can I do that? Let's make a library of it. And that point, I was like the dog. I didn't know what I was doing. So I searched in the internet all the documentation in Vue, how to do a plugin, a library, how I just read the code of important libraries like Vue Router or Vue Next, Vue X, and
Hi,
I learned how to do it. And the result of it is this Vue Dynamic Forms plugin. Right now, just yesterday, I released the stable version 3.0.0. Well, it's now in 3.x.x. We are currently in the 3.13.2 version, and this is the one that holds the Vue 3 support. So you have the documentation also at this URL as all documented. I'm working right now on documenting the Vue 3. There is a migration guide there already, but I'm working currently on creating all the complete documentation for it. So in one point, I was doing the code base for the Vue2.x support. It was all in the master until the version 2.1.0. Meanwhile, I was trying to support Vue 3 and it was released in the early stages. I created an X, something similar to what major libraries did, creates a next branch that holds the new stuff. And right now I merged it like the Sunday yesterday into master. So the latest stable version is this one. It holds the Vue 3 support. If you want to use it for Vue 2, you probably need to go to this tag, 2.1.0, to use it. It was complicated to maintain and code the two code bases by my own in the same repo. So I kind of like dropped the support for Vue 2 and focus on the Vue 3 because it's the new stuff. But of course, if there are issues or feature requests on the repo to continue working on the Vue 2, probably will do it. So to wrap up a little bit, the future is that I will complete the Vue 3 documentation. I will add support. I already did an internal project where I had to put it on the repo for field sets and groups. I already managed to do a synchronous external validation. That means that you can call an endpoint to check email uniqueness in the backend, for example, and retrieve the validation into your form. I also tweaking around with Vue Demi and some pull plugins to try to create an installation process that work in this repo for both Vue 2 and Vue 3. The problem is that Vue 2 and Vue 3 has a different render engine, so it's not that easy. I had to check if it's possible with the current code base. So that's pretty much it. Thank you all viewers and Vue.js Berlin for having me here. I'm excited that it's my first talk this year. I hope I didn't do it that bad. And just comment me, pass me your comments, your feedback is really appreciated. You can DM me in Twitter and continue the discussion there. So thank you very much.